I often call you Scott in China. I think I'm going to change that to Austrian Scott. I quite like the sound of that.
Okay.
And it aligns quite nicely with your Substack. So,
That's
Austrian
true.
Scott, thank you for joining me in the trenches again.
Well, thanks for having me.
Right off the bat, let me just say that you've got a great Substack. You're part of a team. It's called Austrian China. Is that correct?
That's right.
What is the purpose of the Substack?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of there are quite a few sources out there of people inside China trying to communicate to a Western audience a more, let's say, realistic view of China than what you typically get from, well, certainly Western media, but actually it's mostly what you get on Western social media. We also have a Chinese language production team. So we actually, most of our content we produce for China, inside China. But for a Western audience, every now and then we do a few things. And I think that as with any country, China has all sorts of problems, and some things go well and some things go less well. And one of our goals that we set ourselves is to try and interpret what's going on in China from the perspective of the Austrian School of Economics, which is somewhat known in China, but there are not very many people that are reporting from that perspective. And the Austrian School of Economics is kind of a toolbox more than anything else, helping you to use economics to understand what's going on. And we try and do that for applying it to China with a focus on, let's say, more a focus on the economy. But of course, the economy is interconnected with all sorts of other things. But inevitably, trying to communicate these, what the reality in China to a Western audience means that we also have to spend some time, as you would often say, debunking myths, debunking propaganda that's being spread in mostly Western social media. Not so much the official media, because the official media is a little bit more careful, but social media, you tend to get a lot of pure propaganda. And I think that's, it's a delicate thing because I don't want to create the impression that that's our sole mission is to debunk Western propaganda and say that everything in China is all rosy. I think that's also one of the things that you appreciate, which not many people do, and is that we try and deliver sort of a more balanced view of China without saying it's perfect, without any problems. On the contrary, it has lots of problems, and that's one of the topics we've talked about several times before, and that is that China is, in that sense, it's really just a normal country. In that sense, it has some things it does well, some things it does less well. It has all sorts of problems, and it's not the authoritarian dystopia that it's painted out to be. But there are some definite authoritarian tendencies there. It's not like that's all imagination either. So I think that's the kind of balanced view that we try and transmit. However, as we both know, that view is not appreciated by very many people. People want to have you really all be on one side or the other. And it's always amazing to me that people accuse you of being a shill for the Chinese Communist Party because you actually deliver a very balanced view, which is unlike most of the people out there, right? And it's not really the same thing when you appreciate the things that do go well, and then but at the same time, and then see the other side as well. It's a puzzle to me how people don't notice it, but I guess it's probably because a lot of the people that do spend time attacking you probably do so because they are being paid to do so. Maybe not, but I get that impression sometimes when I read various posts, which may give me the impression that people are not listening. They're not paying attention. So that's that.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I started re-evaluating my views on China. When I stumbled across your Substack a few years ago, and Substack. I realized that Substack. What did I say?
Really, you said Substack.
it's still morning here.
It's not anymore. Although it could be more. It could be fuller, but it's more than that now.
Yeah, one of the things that caught me about reading the articles that you put out is that you weren't suggesting or haven't been suggesting that China is utopia, and you're also not suggesting that it's this totalitarian hellhole. And I mean, if you if you look at Western media as a whole, it is this totalitarian hellhole where everybody's got social credit scoring and you can't do anything,
right.
and there's this great wall.
Well,
of,
you've sort of had the message delivered: the people live in terror of the government.
Yes, yeah.
And the people. One of the favorite phrases is that people are oppressed. I can't remember if I told you I was at a cocktail party with some in the U.S. a while back. Well, not that long actually. It was half a year ago.
Hold on. Just sorry. Hold on. Let's just contextualize. You're not actually in the U.S. Sorry. You're living in China.
I'm actually in China. Yes, I'm in Shanghai.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, there's this party with some high level political people, and I was trying to do my typical thing of trying to dispel some of the myths, and I think we got to the social credit system, which this guy who allegedly has all these political connections, well informed, and he completely believes the story. He believes the whole thing. And then he asked me this question. Well, I won't go into that right now, but then he asked me, he said, so do you think the Chinese people are oppressed? I said, well, that's a kind of a difficult question, but I'd say in many respects, certainly they feel much less oppressed than the people in the U.S. And that was like, well, that was the question. That was too much for him. But I can understand, because without the information that you need to understand that, then that doesn't make sense, right? But certainly, I would say that in general, Chinese people don't feel particularly oppressed, and that's just even that one statement is kind of a shock for people that read too much Western social media.
And I mean, you're in Shanghai right now, and we are not using a VPN, so there's no great firewall of China.
Well, that's not true. No, there is. China does block some. China does definitely block some sites, although they block less and less. They used to block most of Western media, at least that was my impression. But now, except for a few of the really bad ones, like the New York Times, the BBC, some of the main propaganda organs of the West, most of the media is actually open. So you look at, I think CNN is open even now, and most of the regional newspapers you can reach, they're a little bit less paranoid, I think, about the propaganda. But ultimately, the issue is that the Chinese government, and I'm quite sure of this, they just feel like their propaganda systems are no match for the Western ones. And that's also kind of a little bit difficult for a lot of Westerners to get their hands around, or their head around this idea that the reason they might be blocking things is not because they're afraid of people getting knowing the truth. It's because they're afraid that they won't be able to match the Western propaganda systems. And actually, I have to say, even though I don't agree with their approach, I think it's paternalistic and silly and self-defeating in the end. But in that sense, they are right. Their propaganda systems are worse than the Western ones. There's no doubt about it. Their propaganda organs are very clumsy, and most Chinese don't. I can't say they don't pay very much attention, but they certainly pay a lot less attention than Westerners do to their own propaganda systems. They're much less in tune with what is in the Chinese media. I mean, most people don't watch television in China. The newspapers have practically disappeared. So most people get their information completely from the internet. And the government's censorship systems, and maybe we'll talk about this in a bit, are not very effective. They do try. They definitely try and censor things, and they try and block things they think are make them look bad, but they're not very good at it. So in that sense, I understand where they're coming from. Put it that way, which is not to justify their decision.
When somebody starts rethinking their views on China, I suppose the obvious starting point is trying to reestablish what the CCP or the CPC means and what its relation to China actually is.
Well, that's kind of it is a sensitive topic on social media, because you can really see if people on social media, particularly on X, they refer to the CCP, then you can usually guess where they're getting their information from, because that's not the official term that's used to describe the Communist Party, which is the Communist Party of China, CPC, not the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. That's a Western term. Not that it really makes that much difference, but it is kind of a hint at where they're getting the information from, because you have to know that there are these very well-funded propaganda factories in the West, and there's particularly this one X account called Songping Ank that produces I'm sure they must have 20, 30, 40, 50. Thus far, I think they have somewhere around 400,000 or 500,000 videos that they've shared that are also basically 99% of them are either fake or completely twisted so that their content has no relationship. Their alleged content has no relationship with what is really being shown. So they'll show you a video and they'll explain it in a way that makes no sense. So, for example, they had a video once, I remember a couple of years ago. They showed a video of a fence, and they said it was to keep people out from escaping out of China, and they showed people on the fence. But actually, what it was showing was the opposite. It's the fence there is to keep people from coming into China. So they just turn it completely around, right? And then, but if you're not used to that, expecting that, then they get away with it, right? They're showing you a real video, but they're giving you a completely inaccurate explanation of it. That said, I would say a number of them are completely fake. Like a lot of the ones that refer to this social credit system, so-called, they're completely fake in the sense they're showing you something that has absolutely no relationship with what they're talking about. This is the social credit system. And they might show you, for example, somebody's credit score on their phone for a normal credit score, like most countries have. China has them as well. And they say, oh, this is the social credit. I mean, it's of course incorrect. But my favorite ones are the ones where they show people crossing a street, and they say if you jaywalk, then there's the voiceover that claims this, right? Then they show a picture of the person on a big screen there, and this is persons they found you through the face recognition, and then they say you automatically get fined so and so much, and it gets deducted from your WeChat account, which would be really incredibly sophisticated. But this is, of course, complete fantasy. But if people don't know, they get away with it, right? And the people, of course, anytime as soon as anybody comes to China, immediately they realize that stuff is just not true. But if you don't know, and you already are sort of predisposed, you have been fed this idea for the past 10 years that China is this totalitarian dystopia where the government surveils everything and controls everything and is extremely capable of dealing with all this data, then you believe it, right? We all know it's that bias.
I believed it.
Yeah.
I believed it.
It's understandable. I mean, you've had this propaganda that has been constantly delivered since 2008. That's when it started. And with 2008 to now we're 2025, that's a long time. For some people, it's all of their lifetimes, their adult lifetimes. They've had that since they began to try and understand the world. They've heard that, and so if you deliver anything along those lines, they think, well, that's what I've heard so many times. It must be true. It's understandable, but that's the miracle of propaganda, and that's something the Chinese government is completely incapable of delivering that type of long-term campaign. They just don't have that. They just don't have that level of sophistication or even perspective to deliver that type of long-term type of propaganda plan. Not that they don't try, but that's way beyond their scope of what they're capable of.
I know you've dealt with this question a number of times, but Scott, it keeps coming up. So let's just premise the rest of the conversation on this. The Communist Party of China, the word communist, this gets everybody every time, and it happened again with me the last few days. But they have the word communist. They're commies.
Well, yeah, it's like as we often say, it's like you think just because the Democratic Party of in the United States calls themselves Democratic that they are Democrats, whatever that means. I mean, it's just a name, right? And I think that if you compare it to the situation in other places, you'll realize that's exactly what it is.
North Korea also says democratic in its name.
Right, they say they're democratic, right? And all the countries in Eastern Europe, they always still call themselves democratic, right? So whatever that means. But I mean, I think on objective standards, if the differentiations between communist organization of society and, let's say, a capitalist organization, which is not exact opposites, but just for the sake of argument, we'll pretend it is. Well, then I think one can quite objectively say that China is more capitalist and less communist than certainly any country in the West by far. And that's just really in terms of the role of the state in society, which is the level of control that it has and the level of competition in China that you have in most industries is far, far more intense than in the West. And you also literally, you have China accumulates much, much more capital than any other Western country. It's a huge capital accumulation machine, which is really the essence of capitalism. People often forget that. And so despite all its faults, and China has a lot of waste, right? There's a lot of bad investment out there. But at the end of the day, still the amount of capital being accumulated is enormous. And if you look at the sad situation in places like the United States, for example, if there's any capital being accumulated at all, it's not much. I mean, there is real investment there, but when you subtract out the replacement factor, what needs to be replaced, how much is on the net really going into new investment in productive capital in the U.S., I guess it's probably not too high.
Okay, so let's just quickly hover around that for a second. Opening businesses, doing business in China. Again, one of the tropes is everything is controlled by the Chinese government.
Right. Well, actually, that reminds me of a story that we just mentioned prior to this discussion, and that is the story of the Smithfield Company. Remember when I raised that to you? It's a American company that's specialized in the swine raising industry, and I believe in the U.S. they have like 80% of the pig production. And that company was bought something like 15 years ago, maybe not quite that. I can't remember the exact, something like that, by a Hong Kong-based company. That company was originally a state-run Chinese company back in the day, 1995, but eventually privatized. And at the time when it acquired Smithfield, and I'll get a minute to explain how I'm getting this, it was actually, I think, controlled by Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, they invested in it. And so they bought Smithfield, and they still own Smithfield now. Eventually, Goldman Sachs cashed out. They went public in Hong Kong. Now it seems to be, for the most part, controlled by its leading managers. I think they have about 40% of the shares. But if you listen to the reporting about this company in the U.S., there's this constant discussion of how the Chinese own all of our farmland. They're buying up all of our farmland. And just recently, there was a piece that RFK Jr. did talking about this, and he specifically mentioned the example of Smithfield. He said, yes, and they control 80% of the pig production in the U.S., and they all control its land, and it's owned by the Chinese, right? Or owned by China. I can't remember if he said China or if he said by the Chinese. But that's so typical. It's, China is buying to China owns it. It's not China. It's a Hong Kong listed company that partially belongs to BlackRock, right? So this is so typical. And then, when we talk about when China is the topic of discussion or anything related to China, then it says, the Chinese bought or the Chinese own or China owns. But no, it's just some person or some Chinese company. It's not the same thing as the government, right? I mean, maybe the government in some cases has some share of it, but at the end of the day, most companies, especially most of the productive companies in China, are privately run. The figure is roughly it's roughly 75% of the value added created in China comes from privately run companies, including foreign invested companies. So 25% comes from the state, but they're producing almost none of the new jobs, very little of the export. Basically, they tend to be state monopolies or very, very large, heavy industry monoliths like Ball Steel, for example, producing steel, or in the telecom industry. So those, yes, the state is heavily present, but they're not the ones that are driving the economy. And it just, as we all know, that wouldn't work, right? It wouldn't work. And people, it's so funny because you see people often on the right in the West talking about talking about China and the danger of China and so on. And it seems like you'd think that they would understand that if things were really as they seem to imagine, that the state were running everything, it would never work. It would be a disaster. It would be exactly what happened in China 40, 50 years ago when the whole economy collapsed. Yes, that's what happened. The state was running everything, and it was a disaster. And they used up all the capital and people were starving. It doesn't work. And everybody knows it doesn't work. So it's just a funny thing that people imagine that could possibly work. And certainly that they somehow managed to imagine that China, with this this setup that they seem to believe in, where the state runs everything, actually manages to dominate most of the industry in the world. And most sectors of the economy in the world are dominated by Chinese exporters. How could that be possible? They say, oh, it's because they pay subsidies. No, you cannot. You cannot come to dominate the world's economy by paying
and tariffs.
subsidies. That doesn't work.
And tariffs,
or tariffs, or whatever. But no, you have. The only way you can get this is by being competitive. You can't become competitive by being run by the state. The state is absolutely way beyond its scope of handling anything like that.
Yeah, as I was saying, one of the triggers for me is, why is China always the target of the Western industrial complex?
Is there industrial complex, or is it the political elite, the political?
Okay, yeah, political elite. That's good enough.
I mean, I'm not privy to their conversations, but I think we can all make a guess that it's for good reasons, in the sense that they are afraid of China as a competitor. I think that certainly is the logical explanation. And that's a reasonable fear. But as Trump himself said back in 2016, he said that China and the U.S. have a bad deal, but I don't blame the Chinese for it. It was mutual. He didn't use exactly those exact words, but that's pretty much what it boiled down to. I mean, it was this whole setup they've been running for the last 25 years, where China's been allowed to accumulate massive export surpluses, and the U.S. and Western Europe, to an extent, have deindustrialized. That was completely agreed on a high level between the leadership of China and the West. I mean, they were both in on it. It could not have happened without complete collusion on both sides. They all had to be in on it. And I don't. My personal opinion, as you probably recall, is that it's not a very good deal it's neither a good deal for China nor for the rest of the world. Why should China be dominating all of these industries? Why can't the playing field be a little bit more even, and give companies in some other countries a chance to compete? But I don't think you can't blame that all on China either. It was both sides that were in on this deal. And where we are now, we're in a difficult situation because of the economies of scale in so many industries. It is very, very difficult for Western companies to compete with China. But we have this bizarre situation where China in so many areas is producing everything for the entire world, and it can keep doing that, and in return it's accumulated ever larger amounts of debt, right? The rest of the world owes China. I don't see what's in it for China. I think that it would be a much better deal to even the playing field a bit, not with tariffs, but just by adjusting the exchange rate and giving the Western companies a little bit better chances. But our government doesn't want to do that. So there we are.
But you were alluding to the fact that the Chinese government is not actually all that brilliant. They make a lot of mistakes and bad judgment calls.
I'd say that's definitely one of them, in my opinion. And because what they're doing is they're trying to harken back to their wishful thinking of a planned economy, and they see that China well, first of all, the government is running a huge deficit, and one of the reasons they're doing that is because they are not collecting taxes, because companies are not investing, or they are investing, but they're investing less than they would in a real let's say balanced economy. And the reason for that ultimately is because the Chinese government is still interfering too much. At least that's my opinion. They're still trying to favor certain sectors, and mostly what they're doing is they're forcing a unrealistic exchange rate on the economy. So if they were to allow the exchange rate to come to a normal level, which I'd say it has to be about half of where we are now, then there would be some adjustment. And yes, okay, some of the Chinese export industries would drop off a little bit, but then there would be other compensations. Things would become much cheaper to import. We could import many more services from the West, not only products, but also services. And things would have a way of balancing themselves out. But if the government insists on saying, okay, well, so we have all these unemployed people, and what are we going to do? And let's subsidize the electric car industry, right? But so then the electric car industry grows and grows and grows, but then it produces too much, right? So this is all the problem with central planning. I don't create the wrong impression to give the idea that China's centrally planning everything. They aren't, but the sectors they do try and centrally plan almost all basically create what in Austrian terms we would call malinvestment. They're putting too much money in the sector, and as a result, in the car industry in general now, prices in China are half the level they are outside of China. You can get the exact same car here for half of what you get in the rest of it. Not only electric cars, but even petrol-driven cars. It's because the competition is so intense here. So everybody's losing money, right? It's really not a good solution, right? It's all because the government has tried to push that sector. So it hurts the competition in the West, but also hurts China. Nobody's profiting from this. So they should just, the Austrian perspective is they should just let things go. And the market will sort things out. They'll find useful things to do. But right now, all these plants are occupied producing cars, and the people are occupied. Free the people, free the plants, and they'll find something more productive to do, something that's profitable, right? That's the Austrian perspective. And I think at some point the government's going to wisen up to this, but they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, in South Africa, we have a massive influx of Chinese cars, and they're a lot better priced than the, let's say, European cars. In fact, I think it was Volvo that put out a plea to our government a few months ago, asking to put penalties on Chinese car imports.
Really, but don't forget, Volvo is Chinese. Volvo is Chinese.
Then maybe it wasn't Volvo, but it was a European manufacturer. I forget now who it was. I don't know if Volvo is Chinese. Is that true?
Yes, it was bought by China, but they're one of our big customers, I know. So, yes.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. But anyway, the point I was making is that the old trope of Chinese goods being cheap junk is gone. I mean, Chinese cars now are incredible. They're incredible. My next car will be Chinese, hands down.
It is true. You're right. And so some of the parts of the world, no doubt, in China as well, we also benefit from this, from the intensive competition, and quality goes up, prices go down. But I'm just saying, at the end of the day, those funds, probably those resources, could be used elsewhere better. There's too many resources going into that industry. But yeah, of course, yeah, we probably all benefit from it. Yeah, the cars are wonderful, and I used to work for Mercedes-Benz, and we back in the day, Mercedes-Benz, we had our own strengths, but we really looked to Toyota as the example of how to produce things economically and be sort of cutting edge in terms of quality management. And that's now been taken over completely by China. And even now, Mercedes-Benz is planning to use, in the future, it's planning to use Chinese-built engines for everything.
You mentioned Mercedes-Benz. They were one of the worst performing cars in South Africa in terms of sales, and it's Audi, not Volvo. It was Audi that they contacted the government. It's ridiculous, though. I mean, just make better cars.
The rest will profit from it. I mean, it is true. I mean, they are very efficient, and they are, like you say, I mean, in terms of quality, in terms of the feature set, it's hard to beat. That's true.
There is censorship in China. There's censorship everywhere. There's censorship across Europe, in the UK even. I mean, look what's going on now in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in the UK, so I'm always hesitant to judge places where I'm not personally in, because I don't know how much I'm getting as propaganda and how much is that accurate. But it sounds pretty shocking when you read the numbers of allegedly several thousand people in prison for comments on social media. I think in China that would be unimaginable, just as a point of comparison. I'm no big fan of Chinese censorship policy. In fact, as you probably know, I've ridiculed it many times because I think it's ridiculous. That's the only word that comes to mind. But while it's ridiculous, it's not particularly totalitarian. It's very rare for people to go to prison for something they wrote on social media here. It's almost unheard of. I can think of a few examples I know of. But really, these people were people that just kept at it, and the government would tell them, like, "Oh, we're going to please cool it," and then like the ones that are parading on the street, demonstrating, and So eventually, if you keep pushing them, eventually, yes, they will put you in prison. But you have to work really hard at it because it's not part of the Chinese system. So what typically happens here, if you write something they don't like, then, well, first of all, the most likely thing is they'll just delete it, if they even notice it at all. But I mean, there are so many billions of comments all the time. Most of the stuff never gets noticed at all anyway. But even if there's something that gets noticed, first of all, they're likely to delete it. But if you keep doing it over and over again, the things that really irritate them, then eventually you might get a call. What they typically do is they'll call your employer or your parents. And they'll say, XYZ, particularly if the person's, let's say, under 30 or so, is, a little overdoing it, tell him to cool it. Over 30, more likely to go to his, maybe over 20, more likely to go to his employer. We actually gotten calls like that before. Actually, I only know of 2 cases. One I can think of here in Shanghai, where one of our employees was talking about, he was writing stuff about something about the Philippines and the situation there with them. And there was, I don't know, in that case, he was written something they didn't like. So he'd written a message on multiple occasions. So they asked us to have a discussion with him and tell him to cool it. That's kind of typical. The other possibility is that they might actually call you to give a statement to the police. So then the police call you up and they say, yeah, well, you said stuff, it's difficult. Why don't you come down and have a talk with us? That's also happens. I know of several cases like that. But it's quite civilized. I'm not supporting this policy, but you don't come in, like in the US, have people coming in at 5 a.m. with a SWAT team to raid your house, breaking down your door. That just doesn't happen. They just call you and they say, well, you come to the police station to give a statement. Which is relatively civilized. That said, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the restrictions are ridiculous. Like my favorite example is you're not allowed to mention the name of the great ruler, the party secretary, general secretary, president of China. You can't mention his name, and you can't even allude to him with references. It's because only the official media is allowed to do that. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
Why though? What's the reason?
I don't know. I'm not privy to their conversations, but it's just one of their rules, right? And even the police think it's stupid, right? So, like, I know of a case. They were in a private group and they chat group, and they were talking about, they were alluding to him by reference, and then as like the honored one or something like that. And they got called to the police, and the police thought the whole thing was, of course, silly anyway. They said, "Why don't you just write that you'll never do it, and won't do it again, and that's over, right?"
And it's both positive and negative. You can't speak about him.
No, it doesn't even matter. You can't even praise him, right? That's ridiculous. I mean, there's really no other word to describe it, right? And everybody thinks it's ridiculous, right? So, but I'm sure that in the UK you don't have that, right? So you can't say it's all black or white. So in the UK you can talk. I'm sure you can talk about Starmer all you want. Well, maybe you can't, but you can probably at least get away with mentioning his name. But here you can't. So in that sense, China is much less free than the UK. But probably in the level, let's say, in the civilized approach towards censorship, I'd say China wins hands down.
And there are also interesting topics that are very different in sort of Western countries. You can't, for example, in most Western countries, question the Holocaust, or even, as Trump wanted to do recently, criticize Israel. He wanted to criminalize those. He said he wants to criminalize anybody who criticizes Israel.
That you can do in China. If those are things that you find someone finds, let's say, relevant to discuss, then China's a good place to do that, because you will never get arrested here for that. And Chinese social media is full of such discussions. However, once again, I mean, like this, for example, one of the things that I would say about the current situation in the Middle East is that the Chinese government has done absolutely nothing in terms of deeds to back up its words. And I would say that's worthy of substantial criticism, but you won't find that in China's social media.
You can't protest either. Like the Chinese government doesn't like people protesting in the streets.
Protests. They don't like people protesting in the streets. They really don't like that. So if you really want to get yourself in trouble, then you go protest in the street.
So it's difficult to be a political cartoonist in China.
Yeah, you can. Well, there are a lot of cartoonists. In fact, there's some really good ones that work for Global Times. Their outlet. They make a lot of really good cartoons ridiculing the West. But you can't ridicule things related to China. That's true. So once again, I'm not a fan of that. I'm not trying to defend that system at all. I'm just saying if you do an objective comparison with other countries that are also practicing various forms of censorship, China doesn't come off all too bad. I'd say on average, the U.S. is still the country with the least amount of censorship that I'm aware
Mm.
of. Where you really do have the most. But in the U.S. also, if you talk about forbidden topics, then the danger, of course, is that you face a loss of income and that you will be ostracized or taken off various social media sites. And in China, we kind of have the same thing in a way, except that obviously, once again, like you mentioned, the topics are different. But if you sin too often, for example, you can get your WeChat account can be prevented from making comments, or in the worst case, you can actually your WeChat account can get completely frozen, and you have to open up a new one. In which case, you lose all your contacts. But
Yeah, you
yeah,
called that the Singaporean route, didn't you?
no, that was the Singaporean model. That was really referring to that's one approach that China takes towards keeping stopping people from saying things they don't like, and that is by finding companies. There was that case that we reported about a couple of years ago where this comedy production company, one of their top comedians had made some joke which was taken to be insulting to the army, and they fined them almost $2 million for this joke, and then banned them from appearing for a month or so. I think that was the Singaporean approach because it was the Singapore kind of. I think they were kind of pioneers in that area of trying to suppress political opposition by basically fining people out of existence. They were just enormous fines. They'd be like, okay, I get it. So they wouldn't imprison them, but they just make it economically to the price too high. So China does use that approach as well, but more for companies like that. For individuals, not so much. For individuals, it's just like I said, that story I told you before.
Mm. I think the undercurrent so far is that China is a normal country. It's not special. It's not unusually different to any other country. It has its own challenges and it's got its good things and bad things. The government makes good decisions and makes bad decisions like every other country. Another bad decision was the COVID response in 2020.
Yeah, I think, and that's certainly true. It was, I think, their initial response didn't work out as well at all. But to be fair, I think if we go back and look at the record, we can see that what China did in February of 2020 was exactly what was written in that lockstep scenario that the Rockefeller Foundation put out in, I think, 2010. And they obviously had that in their drawers. And they pulled it out of the drawer and just did exactly what was written there. And they did that for about 2 months. And then somebody said, this is not working and we can't keep doing this. And then they changed course. So like also the whole thing with the ventilators was obviously not working. And it took them about 4 to 6 weeks to figure that out. And of course, the amazing was by the time that China had figured it out, that this ventilator thing wasn't working, that was when New York was saying, we have to buy 500,000 ventilators, right? So the West went whole hog at the moment when China had actually already figured out this was not working at all. And also the whole lockdown thing was not sustainable, right? So they pretty quickly figured that out. So then they went to a much more localized approach, which in the end also ended up being unsustainable. But it was certainly much more sustainable than their initial approach, which was the one they practiced in places like New Zealand, for example, where they actually locked down the whole country for long periods of time, which is incredible to believe that anybody could be so stupid as to believe that would actually work. But it's like they were. You look at what's going on. How can they be so dense and not realize this is not going to work, right? Well, at least China realized that was not sustainable. So so they stopped and they went to a very, very localized, and sometimes localized down to the point of an individual like block area. They said, we'll quarantine just this individual block, and that's it. And then we won't, because the economy would collapse. You can't do that. Later on, I think they also made a really one of the most stupid thing was that they did was they didn't realize they didn't. Well, they did realize, but the central government refused to accept that this whole quarantine approach was not going to work anyway, no matter what. Even the more focused quarantine approach they used was also going to be ultimately a failure. And it was clear by even the beginning of 2022 that that was not going to work. And they just, the central leadership in Beijing refused to accept the obvious. But eventually reality overcame them, as we know, in 2022, and they gave in. And
Scott, come on. We all know the Chinese government welded people's doors shut.
Right. That was that's a good example, because that's a great example of the effectiveness of propaganda, and it is a good example of the concept of generalization. I don't know if that even happened at all. It's possible, maybe it did happen somewhere, that somebody was welded in, which is almost impossible to believe, but maybe it did happen. But if it did happen, it was a massive violation of the fire regulations, and you'd have to be insane to believe that would be sustainable. And certainly, it never happened on a large scale. And probably, if it was actually happened, whoever did it was probably disciplined for it, because it's crazy, it's insane, right? Another good example is, an even better one, in fact, it's a story about the pets being killed. That was one of the other favorites that went around Western social media for probably more than years. Yes, the Chinese are killing all the house pets. Well, that story actually went back. There was a piece of truth, a grain of truth in that it actually did happen once. In fact, it was here in Shanghai, and some crazy official did actually apparently kill some dog. And it appeared pretty quickly after that in the newspaper, and the government attitude was this guy lost it, and this is obviously not acceptable. We can't have that. But so it was actually internally in China, it was over pretty quickly. It was recognized, reported on. No, this is some officially going overboard. But in the Western social media, and not the Western mainstream media, but the social media, it became what's that word called? What do you call that in English when it's just that gets repeated over and over and over and over and over again? And then it was all of this very general saying, like the Chinese are killing all the house pets. It really was going back to one incident, right? And it was generalized, and people in their own sphere, they're I think most people are aware of this issue of generalization. But when it's something from China far away that has this terrible reputation of the government controlling everything, then people are more likely to believe it, even though it's just a typical example of overgeneralization.
What's another example of overgeneralization within the Chinese context? Cryptocurrency. I'm trying to think now if there's an overlap there, because that's a big topic at the moment with the US and stablecoins.
I'd say that's an example of the Chinese government's inability to face reality, and to let's say their ambition in terms of control is much higher than their ability. So the cryptocurrency industry was really centered in China for many years until 2017. And still, even today, many of the largest exchanges in the world are Chinese. For example, Binance is still one of the, it's probably still officially the largest, it was originally based here in Shanghai. And then in 2017, the government decided they didn't like cryptocurrency anymore because they felt it was infringing on their control of financial flows, which is kind of true. But instead of trying to regulate the industry, eventually they decided to just ban it, which I'd say it was a really big mistake, because not only did they destroy a bunch of their really good companies or hurt them significantly, but then they actually made it impossible for them to work with the exchanges to deal with, for example, fraud. And we have a big problem, almost a big problem all around the world, but certainly in China, we also have a big problem with fraud, particularly defrauding elderly. And then when the fraudsters want to go launder that money, they typically launder it into stablecoin, to USDT stablecoins, which is kind of the number one black market currency, both in China and all across Southeast Asia. So in the old days, what would happen is the police would just go to the major exchange and say, please help us, we have this case, black money, whatever. crime, please help us out and deal with it. But now they can't do that because it's all illegal. So now the police have no recourse. There's no official recourse. Sometimes there's some, they're unofficially, they say, oh, we know this person in such and such town. There's like their local money changer, and he'll do it. And then maybe the police know the guy, and they'll work some deal with him in the back office. But it makes it much more difficult to deal with. And that's I think it's a good example of refusing to face up to the reality that this is going to exist whether you permit it or not. You might as well come up with a system that allows you to actually work with the people in the industry instead of just pretending it doesn't exist. So once again, there, I guess you could say governments in general make that mistake. They say, well, what we intended, our intention was good, right? Well, no, but you didn't look at the result. The result is bad. Because it doesn't matter what your intentions were. And particularly just going outright and banning things, that rarely leads to good result. Same thing goes with the education industry, where a couple of years ago, the government said, oh, the children are having to study too much. It's too much work and it's too expensive for the parents. They keep sending their kids to these external schools to, get them ahead in school. So the government basically banned the whole tutoring industry overnight, which is crazy, right? And so you destroyed a whole bunch of jobs. Didn't completely destroy the companies. Some of the companies survived, but still, it was a big blow to them. But did the tutoring industry disappear? No, not at all. I kept going. Of course, the Chinese not going to stop tutoring their kids. Are you kidding? The idea that anybody could have believed that they would actually ever work is ludicrous. Chinese are some of the most education-oriented people in the world. They're not going to stop tutoring their kids. So what happened? Well, the prices went up. So what happens to the people that were a little bit poor, the families a little bit poor, they got edged out of the market. So they couldn't afford it anymore. That was the result. It wasn't that the kids had less pressure or the parents got to save some more money. No, the parents had to spend more money now. So instead of looking at the results, they just, our intentions were good. So of course, as anybody could have expected, a year or two later, the government, we said, well, okay, yeah, we parents never.
But I think, Scott, that's the overgeneralization that I was referring to earlier. Is that the Chinese government is this well-oiled machine that is always ahead of the curve. It's
exactly right, and they're not at all. They're not at all. And I'll give you another example. We mentioned that earlier. That this recent Tianshui case with the lead poisoning. So there you have a typical example. There's all these kids from this elementary, it's actually kindergarten, private kindergarten. 200 plus kids show up with some sort of symptoms of poisoning. Don't know what it is. Go to the local hospital. How the local hospital says they don't know what it is, what's going on. But actually, we found out right away they probably did know what was going on, but they didn't want to say. So some parents said, well, we don't believe you. And so they took their kids to other hospitals in other big cities, Tianjin, I think, and Xi'an. This was in Western China, in Tianshui, which is way out in the boonies, mid-sized city. And then the hospitals in the big cities said, yeah, they have lead poisoning, right? And so basically the government tried to cover it up. And then they came up with this ludicrous story that the school was mixing in lead paint with a food to make it more shiny or colorful, it's so ludicrous. I don't know who thought of that story, but who could believe that? I mean, it's not water soluble. I mean, it's a preposterous story. The truth seems to be that what's really going on is they have a lead zinc factory in the town, and that's on the banks of the river, and that they've been contaminating the water table with lead. And what the school did was, because it was a privately owned school, and so the school, because they were in it for profit, they sank their own well instead of paying the high water rates, and so they took water from their own well, and that's how the kids all got poisoned. But of course, the government couldn't allow that to come out, because that would reveal the whole water table was contaminated. And why is the water table contaminated? Because they didn't obey the environmental regulations that prohibited this plant from being erected next to the river. So they tried to cover the whole thing up and try to suppress the discussion, but it all failed, and it all came out. And now everybody in the country knows, right? And so now they look really stupid. Not only do they come up with this really stupid story that is so preposterous to like how could they be so stupid that anybody would actually believe that with the paint, right? And then they're trying to cover up. They actually coerced the hospital into covering up the truth and not telling the parents what was going on, which is itself a crime, right? And so probably the end result, what typically happens in a case like this, they'll probably can the entire leadership of all of the city, and they'll all lose their career in the party because of this. So the government makes themselves look stupid, but there is a correction mechanism in there. There's like a feedback mechanism that works. So it's not like there's not. So yes, the government does some stupid things, but there is a kind of a feedback mechanism that works, and it kind of comes out and works out in the end. But of course, the only reason this feedback mechanism works is because their whole idea, their whole totalitarian concept of the government controlling it doesn't work, right? If it did, then there would be no feedback mechanism. But because it doesn't work, there is, and it does work, right? So it's a good example of how, yes, they have authoritarian tendencies, and maybe that's in an idealized world they could control everything, but they don't. And because there is no social credit system, for example, people are not worried about writing things the government doesn't like and say, oh, the government is tolerating, for example, this lead poisoning. Well, there is no social credit system, so people don't worry about that sort of thing. They just write whatever they think. I mean, if they write on their blog or whatever, the government should be kicked out of office. Well, that wouldn't go over well, right? But if they just complain about the lead poisoning, nobody's going to go after them for that.
The idea of a social credit system is obviously quite nuanced. I think every country has it to some degree. Even here, if I'm applying for a car loan or a home loan, they do a credit check on you. That is a type of social credit system to some degree.
Well, not the way it's been sold in the West, right? In the West, it's been sold as this concept of whether you're politically correct, right? And that does exist to a certain extent in every country, because there are ways of discovering whether you're politically correct, and that can influence your career and so on. But it's much more indirect. Like, so if you apply for a job, typically even in the West as well, as far as I understand, they'll look up your social media posts. And now even the U.S. government's come out and said anybody that says anything bad about Israel or something will not get admitted to the United States, right? That's, you got to watch out. But I'd say compared to what goes on in the West, China is probably much less systematic in doing that. Maybe because China has so many people, they don't have the resources to try and do that on the scale that seems to be going on in the UK, certainly. I say seems because once again, I don't know. I'm not in the UK. I don't want to judge that, but it certainly seems like that level of supervision or surveillance that's going on there. Social media is much more intense than in China. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong. But if you watch some of these fear porn documentaries that have come out over the last few years, the social credit score, and it shows you these aerial shots of each Chinese citizen with little squares. You know what I'm talking about? Right? Yeah, little boxes.
Yeah, well, I tell you, it's this Twitter channel, this X channel called Songbing Ang that makes those videos. Yeah,
but I mean,
what can I
basically, you're not going to get penalized because you buy meat.
No, and it's really not for jaywalking. People jaywalk all the time, and nobody notices, and certainly there's no record of it.
Every single time, Scott, I do a conversation like this, I always get somebody saying, "Yes, but look at this YouTube channel. There's some guy called something ZA or Serpent ZA or something."
Serpent, which is Serpent South Africa, Zuid-Africa, right? It's ZA, and
he lived there for 12 or 15 years, and
those two guys, they do well. I mean, I guess they're either being paid, or maybe it's just through the YouTube, because YouTube promotes them so heavily. I'm sure they get a lot of monetization from YouTube. But yeah, they seem to have made a career out of that. What can I say?
But I mean, are they telling the truth, or are they propagandizing the truth, or what?
I don't watch much of their production, I have to say. I have to confess. In the old days, a couple of years ago, I did watch a few, but just for research purposes. Yeah, I'd say it's pretty much all fantasy. I mean, they don't live in China anymore because they were. I think they would have difficulties if they were to try to come back. I don't think they would be letting or going to get a visa, but they've been gone now for over 10 years. So, but these people are really low life. I mean, in one of their videos, they said, Chinese don't love their children. I mean, stuff like that. And this is like from a guy that's married to a Chinese woman, right? I mean, I don't know. Low life is the only word that comes to my mind from people like that.
And the point is that people should go, shouldn't they, and go see for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, particularly from the West, I think it's typically a shock for most people because they've never been in such a futuristic place, really. And certainly, some people say, "Oh, it's just the big cities." No, it's not. China looks like this all over the whole country. It's you have beautifully paved roads and high-speed trains and shiny metros all over the country. Sometimes you have to wonder if the government's investment is really, if they're not overdoing it a bit. But in terms of the basic infrastructure, it's very good throughout the country. And, because China is at the cutting edge of so many industries, well, like the one we talked about, the electric car industry. Yeah, I mean, it's just, you have a level of technology in society that is unmatched anywhere else in the world. And certainly in society in China really works, right? And it's particularly in a lot of Western countries, where things don't work. And even, let's say, places like South Africa, where many things don't work. Yeah, I think it is a shock to see that how well things work in China. And it is a superficial impression to a certain extent, because there are things that don't work in China. You don't see those immediately, right? So don't get me wrong, but it is good to have that comparison. And and it's not all on China's side. We don't have, for example, the right to carry arms here. You can't go hunting here, which you guys can do there. So you have to sort of take the good side of it. But yeah, people should definitely come and see for themselves. And it's seeing is believing, as the saying goes, right? You can't get it the same way from a distance. And it's funny. I had a friend of mine that was thinking about coming to China, but she said she was so afraid because here people so rarely use cash anymore. She didn't really like the concept of using her phone to pay for things. Well, I mean, if that's a principle that you want to fall on, then that you want to make that, allow it to decide where you go in the world, then so be it. But yeah, it's part of the deal.
Well, actually, just on that, a lot of people also misunderstand how these things work in different countries. In South Africa, it's not a good idea to carry cash. It's a dangerous country.
Yeah.
Carrying cash is a terrible idea.
Yeah, well, here you don't have that problem, of course, because we have almost no crime. There's no public theft of anything, really. So you don't have that issue at all. It's just people pay things with their phone for reasons of convenience. But it's funny, in China, there's some things that pay with cash, and those might be large transactions, but small transactions all by phone, but not for fuzz of fear. It's just as easy. And I mean, but for a long time, I would still carry some cash that, well, if I needed, you never know when you might need it. But I have to admit, even 2 or 3 years ago, I kind of gave up on that. And it's just all you need is a phone. And it is phone based. It's not by facial recognition. There are a few places where you can pay by face if you signed up for that feature with one of the server payment providers, but it's pretty rare. A couple of years ago, people I think did it for kicks. A couple of stores, but it seems to have completely disappeared now. I don't see it at all anymore.
I did experience facial recognition technology when I was in Hong Kong, though.
Doing what?
Yeah, well, for example, at the airport.
Oh yeah, well, that's all over the West too. In the U.S. now, if you leave, whenever you get on a plane, they all do facial recognition now to get on the plane. I don't know where they have a copy of my friend's face from. I'd like to know, but they do. Here in China, we don't have facial recognition for at the airport that I know of. But yeah, I mean, there are systems in China. There's a lot of cameras, and that's a long story as to why that happened, the whole terrorism thing. But yeah, in China, if you're on the wanted list, eventually they will catch you via facial recognition. It's true, and that's also probably one of the reasons why crime is so low.
Yeah, we can't come in for landing because you mentioned cameras, and somebody's going to ask about that. So quickly tell me a bit more about that. Why are there so many cameras?
Because there was a spate of terrorism back in, 2008 to 2014, roughly. And the usual suspects, I think we can be pretty sure were behind that. I'm talking about people outside of China that were supplying that and organizing them. They were mostly terrorists from Xinjiang, from the western part of China, and they blew up train stations and marketplaces and stuff, and the Chinese government, whoa, we got to do something to stop this. And so that was really what pushed it, go kicked it off. And so they put up facial recognition all around the country to stop the terrorism. And that was, and well, they succeeded. I'm not sure whether it was worth it or not. I don't know, but I'd say if you asked an average Chinese, do they mind the surveillance? I'd say most people don't, because you can see the obvious advantages because it's so difficult to get away with a crime that's committed in public because of the surveillance. And even smaller things. For example, I had a couple of twice last year. I had run-ins with scooter drivers, and then called the police, and the police said, "Okay, well, we'll get the video right from wherever it is, nearby to saw what happened, and then they can use the video to make an assessment, which is handy, right?" So in one case, then I think technically it was maybe my fault, but then the policeman said, "But the guy was obviously speeding; he was driving too fast, so you can't say it was all your fault." So at the end of the day, it was like, okay, never mind. So that's handy, right? So I think most people don't see that as something negative. But that's also because the government doesn't use it to, as far as at least people don't have the impression government is using it to track them. And I know for a fact the government, for the most part, has no idea where people are. That's also something that's very hard for people in the West to imagine, that there are hundreds of millions of Chinese living in cities where they're not registered. And the government has no idea where they live, and they don't actually care. They don't even try and track these people. And we know that for a fact because there's lots of evidence for this that the government doesn't know. But if you do get on the wanted list, they try and track you, then they use it. So that's the difference. But people don't perceive the government as tracking them because they know from multiple examples in their lives that the government has no idea where they are. So they don't have that paranoia that people associate in the West with, the government is tracking me. And they know that as far as people's experience is, that what they do use the cameras for is to either track criminals or to figure out what happened in case of an accident. That's how most people interact with the cameras.
Okay, looking at the time, how can I follow your work?
Well, yeah, I will share a couple of this. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a lot of production in Chinese as well, but we also do some things for the Western market. And one of the projects that we've been working on for a while now is a project called Quantum Intel. Website is quantumintel.me. And that's actually mostly for the Western market. And it's to help independent media provide a platform for independent media, so you can find independent media, what independent media is talking about in all these different areas all around the world. So, like, for example, you can check out UK columns. We have a library, and that UK column is in there as well. I think I looked up the UK column today, and I think the UK column has over 1,000 entries actually. So you can actually go to the UK column page on our website, and I think the UK column is 9330. That's the feed number. And then you can actually do a search. For example, you can see, let's say you look up, for example, censorship. You want to know what UK column has had to say about censorship in the last couple of years. And I looked it up today, and UK column has 12 different episodes about censorship in the last 3 years. And you can find out what they are. So it's kind of a handy thing. But you could also look up and see what people are talking about in other countries, in other language zones. And sometimes it's also really interesting to look up what other countries are not talking about. So, for example, a couple of years ago, some listeners may recall, there was a really hot podcast put out by Tucker Carlson that he did with Daryl Cooper. And it was sort of the talk of the country in the US. I don't know about the UK, but it was some sensitive topics, and there are a lot of articles about him. But if you looked up Daryl in the German press, or the German independent media, or in the French independent media, you would discover nothing. He was completely blocked out. So it's actually quite interesting to see what's not being discussed. But because you can do that content search through the platform, you can find that out. And we also have a translation function, so if you're not too comfortable reading German, then it will translate it for you. So that's also kind of handy. So that's one thing you can check out. And then, of course, you can also check out our Austrian China Substack, which is Austrian China, Austrian with an N, as in the country Austria, Austrian China .substack.com.
What's the quantum URL again?
quantumintel.me. So it's all quantum like quantum physics, and intel like intelligence.me. And if you enter 9330 there, you'll see at the top on search for that, and you'll find that's the UK column, the main UK column feed. Although you also search for UK column as well, but that's just the abbreviation.
Austrian Scott, it is always a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you, Jerm.